So today we're going to lead off with a discussion of what does the NINDS Advisory Council do. And I know that some of you will be attending council tomorrow, so I thought this would be, we all thought this would be a very useful introduction to what council does and how it works. So I'm going to turn this over to Dr. Alan Willard now, who is the Deputy Director of the Division of Extramural Research in NINDS. It's all yours, Alan.
Good morning. This continues a trend that we've had in these meetings of trying to explain some of the processes by which NINDS does its business. Over the years, we've talked about things like peer review, so today we'll talk about council. And we've got so Amy, Rick, and I will be co-moderating this, and then we have three current council members on the panel, and I see Sharon Hesterly in the audience, and Eileen Miller was here, and do we have any other council members? So we have 5 current council members here, so I think we should have a good perspective. So basically, I'm gonna give you a very brief introduction, and then we're gonna turn it over to a panel discussion, but we'll just talk about who is council and what do they do. Okay, so just to give you a description, each NIH institute has an advisory council, and our charter has 18 members, and we aim for basically 6 basic scientists, 6 medical scientists, and 6 public members. Frequently, people have a broader range of expertise than that, and many people are both basic scientists and medical scientists. Among the public members, we particularly look for people with expertise in things like public policy or law, but maybe the most important thing is an interest in some aspect of the NINDS mission, and something that every council member brings to the table is an interest in some part of what NINDS does. People come from all over the country. We try to get a diverse mix of folks, and the people serve 4-year terms. I know for some of them it feels longer than that. For others it feels like, oh my God, they were just here and now they're leaving already. So it's kind of interesting. You go from feeling like you just joined to, holy cow, this is my last meeting. And there must be an intermediate life form, but it's hard to spot. So the terms are staggered, so we have about a quarter of the membership turning over each year, and the rosters are approved by the Department of HHS. So it is a formal nomination process that we put people through, and we receive a large number of suggestions. We look through a large number of people. We look for the commitment to the NINDS mission. We look for a balance of expertise in terms of both public issues and scientific and clinical issues. And some of the most important things really are the personal traits in terms of people who can take off their individual interest hat and really work to give NINDS the best advice. And really the job of council is to look out for NINDS as a whole. So just to give you a simple description of the roles of council, one of the ones that they do, and I'll say a little bit more about this in the next couple slides, is they do serve as a second level of grant review. So there's both an open session, which a number of you will be attending, and that is the session where we talk about things like various goals and priorities of the Institute, and that's where we get our best advice from council. They also provide concept clearance, and then in the closed session there is there's a fairly intense review of a variety of grants. I'm going to say a little bit more about that because that's the part you won't be able to see. So in terms of just keeping things unmysterious, I'll say a bit about that. In terms of the kinds of goals and priorities that council talks about, it's very broad, varies quite a bit from one meeting to the next. It can be things such as strategies about how best to allocate our resources. Are we better off putting more money into a series of support centers for some kind of technical area? Are we better off putting more money into individual research grants? What are the best strategies for training the next generation of investigators? What kinds of grant mechanisms and incentives should we put in place? Frequently, the council will receive reports from working groups that have looked in detail at some areas. So we have had stroke planning groups in recent years. This particular round, we're going to receive a report from a conference on Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. There was a big conference in this very building in the spring, and there were some recommendations that came out of that conference, and there will be a report that's presented to council tomorrow afternoon. So it's quite a range of inputs that council gets, and they help us try to figure out what are the best strategies for achieving our goals and how can we most efficiently use the dollars that we have. Now, in terms of what we do in the extramural part of NINDS, by far the largest fraction of our spending goes out in the form of grants to support research. And in terms of the life cycle of a grant, people who would like to get grant support from NIH submit through an electronic system called grants.gov. They come into NIH, they get referred to a particular institute. So as Story told you yesterday, there are a number of institutes, 24 of which make grant awards. After they've been assigned to an institute, they go to study sections where their scientific merit is evaluated, and there are hundreds of study sections that meet 3 times a year. After the applications have been evaluated for scientific merit, then the results of those evaluations are analyzed by institute staff who propose a funding plan to council. And council then looks at the funding plan, makes their own recommendations, and the combination of recommendations from institute staff and council goes to the institute director, aka our decider, and then funding decisions are made. So there's quite a long process. I want to give you some sense of the scale. So just to remind you, Dr. Landis talked a bit about our budget yesterday. So in FY13, if we look at the overall NINDS budget, here the reddish or orangish slice is for the intramural program. Those are the laboratories here on campus. That's roughly 10% of our budget. About 3.7% goes to pay the overhead, the salaries of all of us, and then about 86% goes out in the form of extramural support for research. And if we look at how this approximately $1.3 billion goes, there are a couple of points that I want to make here. One is that the average grant duration is 4 years, and so the money that we commit to this year is making 3 additional future year commitments. So it's very important if you look at our total pie here to see that roughly, just if we look at just research project grants, that's what RPGs are, and you can see that's about 77% of the budget. 20% of it is for competing. Those are the ones that have been reviewed by study sections and the ones that are considered by council. But nearly 3 times as much, nearly 60%, is already tied up in the future years. So one of the things that Dr. Landis has to be very aware of and that council is looking very closely at is what kind of commitments are we making for those out years, because if we're not careful, the size of the out year commitments can get even larger and we could have very little money to work with in a current year. So the advice that we get about how we spend our money in any given year and what kind of commitments we're making are very important. Okay, so in terms of what are the things that council and institute staff are looking at as they make their recommendations, well, the most important one is scientific merit. This is not really a problem. We have way more than enough grants of very high scientific merit. So then the question is, of those highly meritorious ones, which ones are we actually going to award? That is, of course, driven heavily by availability of funds. And then the other issue that we talk about is program considerations, and I'm going to give you some examples of that in this next slide, next to the last slide. And there are several categories of drivers of funding decisions. The biggest one is something called pay line. And so the applications get scientific merit review in the study sections. They get a rating. And in most study sections, in addition to the rating, there is something called a percentile, which tells you, so grants get rated, get a score that ranges from 10, which is best, to 90, which is worst. You got a 23. What does that mean? You don't really know. You don't know whether that's good or bad until you find out, well, actually only 2% of grants got better than 23. In that case, that's a great score. If you find out that 45% of grants got better than a 23, then it's a terrible score. And so in order to compare across study sections in terms of just the quality of science that any given study section receives and whether some study sections are easier versus harder graders in terms of the scores that they give, the percentile is used to help compare across the hundreds of study sections that do grant evaluations. And so for a large fraction of the awards that we make, we set an automatic pay line and say, okay, everything that is better than this percentage of grants, we're basically going to automatically pay. And that pay line in the 15 years that I have been at NINDS has been as generous as the 26th percentile and as pathetic as the 9th percentile. Currently, we're sitting at the 14th percentile. So right now, to be automatically paid, you have to be better than 6 out of 7 grants, basically. Okay, so what about that other pot of money that we're looking at? We have, in some cases, special initiatives where we've set aside some money. So Story talked about some things yesterday. For example, the network for supporting clinical trials, or the network that we're just establishing for support of stroke clinical trials. So that was a special competition. There was a pool of money, and so there will be recommendations to the council about which of the groups that applied for a piece of that pool of money we're recommending be paid. I already talked about the importance of being careful about our out-year commitments, and so anytime we're doing any large-scale project, and typically that means big dollars, so if we're going to spend $10 million on something, we'd like to discuss it a bit first, and so those are also things that that council will talk about. And then finally, there's a category called high program priority, and that is used for the pool of applications that are close to the pay line but not quite there, and there are a variety of considerations that go into that. One would be areas of research in which we don't have very much going on and we'd really like to see more going on, and so we would make recommendations in favor of applications in areas where there's very little going on compared to ones where we already have a reasonable amount, or at least a significant amount of money being spent in that area. Other high program priority considerations would be for things like beginning investigators. We're hoping to get additional people into the investigator pool, and so we give a leg up to people who are getting their first grants and just starting their career. So a variety of considerations like that. Okay, I thought I would close by just giving you a sense of some numbers in terms of what it is that we actually ask council to do. So these are just sort of ballpark numbers, but NINDS in recent years has received roughly 5,500 grant applications. And just to give you a sense, the R01 applications that I think were mentioned yesterday, those are kind of the bread and butter grant applications. A typical R01 would be for 4 years, $250,000 in direct costs a year. So it's a $1 million award. We got about 2,200 applications for those per year. And in FY12, which is the last year that we had really complete information on, we made about 400 new R01 awards. Now, of those 400, 335 approximately fell within pay line, but then there were another 65 that we call special, that fell either into some special solicitation or something from new investigators, or were an area of high program priority. And so each council round, there will be a proposal made to council by institute staff of applications that we're recommending to pay that fall into the special category. And we like to give them a range of things to look at. So typically we will propose between 2 and 3 times as many applications in the special categories as we actually will be able to fund. So if during 2012 we made 65 of those so-called special awards or high program priority awards, that means we probably showed to council somewhere between 150 and 200 possible applications that they could look at. So those are the ones where when we send them out, that's where they're really doing their homework looking at that. And those are ones that get particular discussion within the closed session of council, in addition to some of the other categories that I talked about, like high ticket items. Okay, so I hope I've given you just a little bit of background about what council does. I guess one other thing I should say is that each council is a little bit different, and now that you know a little bit about NINDS Council, that doesn't necessarily mean you know how things would work at the National Institute of Aging Council or NIMH or other ones. So each one has different ways of doing it. We like to engage our council members. It's a very talented set of folks. If we're going to bring them in and have them sit around a table, we'd like to actually have them not just be potted plants and sit and listen to us talk, but we'd actually like to give them some substantial things to discuss and make decisions about. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Amy, who is going to elicit some initial thoughts from our panel members.
Thank you, Alan, and good morning, everyone. I think I want to start by extremely brief introduction of our 3 panelists, all of whom are current council members. And then I'd like to, as quickly as we can, get to discussion, because that's what we're here for. Start with David Ginty, who's the Howard Hughes Medical Institute investigator at Johns Hopkins, but as we've learned, soon to go to Harvard. Paul Gross, who's the former chairman of the board of the Hydrocephalus Association, and Kevin McNaught, who's vice president for medical and scientific programs at the Tourette Association. I'd like to start by asking 3 of you if and how long you've been on council, if each of you could say that, and add anything you'd like to say about council in addition or in comment to what Alan has said. And then we'll go through some questions. But again, I encourage all of you, this is intended to be a discussion. Do start with indicating whether you feel like a potted plant or whether, in fact, you agree with Alan that council at NINDS, without commenting on other institutes, truly does bring in different reactions and advice to Story and NINDS staff on their proposals for grant decisions.
Oh, absolutely. So I've been on council for about 2 years now. Before joining the council, I was a research scientist, so I do have some insight into the scientific review process. I was always a little mystified as to how council worked, and of course, joining the council, I got to see that you are in fact not a potted plant. It is indeed a very, very functional component of the grant review process. And as Alan mentioned, there are several different roles that the council plays, and I am delighted to have had the opportunity to be a part of that process. There are a number of things that struck me when I first joined, and I'm hopefully I'll have the opportunity to say a little bit more about that. But I do believe that the council is unique, and I think it plays a significant role in how grants are awarded and how neuroscience research is funded and supported.
So I think actually you don't have the benefit of knowing this, but we all joined council at the same time. So we're all sort of 2-year members of council. I feel closer to a potted plant than what Kevin said. But what's fascinating is so there's a list of 6 public members. And those public members are typically, if not entirely, from patient advocacy organizations. But some of them are from the scientific side, or I see Sharon sitting out there who's from the scientific side. And they'll engage in a level of conversation with the basic scientist or clinician researchers in the room that is, I just sit back and the weeds begin to sprout and whatnot. But that said, I think that there are things that are business issues, that are human face of disease issues that as we sit around the table, Because part of what we do is we develop lots of personal relationships. And I think part of the aspect is you're sitting there and you're looking at a live human person that in some cases has lost their kid, or has a kid that suffers a fair amount, or an adult or whatnot. And I think that makes it very real. It's a very good thing that I've discovered in my work with scientists about how it changes their work when they see the connection to the people that they're affecting. And so I think that's, the weeds pull back a little bit from there. And then I think, being a business person that has gotten involved in medical research and being very sort of goal and metric oriented, I think we also bring a perspective into some of the discussions that may not otherwise be there or be as strongly represented. I think NINDS is incredibly metric oriented, which I love. But I also think there's sort of a work back from the goal orientation that I think some of the business people around the table bring as well. So, and then the one other thing I would say is that I didn't see on your list is there's a lot of working group efforts that get sprouted out of council. And so I've participated in at least one sort of probably 6-month effort on data sharing, which is something I'm incredibly passionate about as someone who's invested in disease research and seen it held on to. And I'm like, no, I want it to go out, and I want all the smart minds that could work on it to work on it. And it's great to see that effort and participate, and led by another council member, and then lots of program staff helping, and then also had lots of sort of individual conversations like with Stephanie Fertig about the SBIR program and things like that, as someone who's applied for a grant and also has business experience. So I don't feel like a potted plant, maybe just a weed. It grows and shrinks, but I am invasive, I will say that.
So I'm one of the basic scientists on the council. I think that council has a huge impact on the NINDS. At least I hope we do. What's interesting for me is that the council is made up of 18 individuals, all of whom have very different areas of expertise and come from experiences. And so sometimes the discussions are quite lively, and I think it's a lot of fun. So we weigh in on scientific merit as Alan said, a second round of scientific review. And that can be quite effective, I think. There's a lot of expertise around the table when we discuss grants during the second round of review, and some really important decisions are made, and I think it's a high-level discussion, and I think it's quite effective. But the other side is there's the issue of unmet needs, and that's and scientific or medical priorities that pertain to the mission of the Institute, and that's discussed as well. And so you have both the scientific merit, how good is the science that's being proposed, and what are the unmet needs. Personally, I feel we could spend a little more time on council discussing unmet needs and scientific goals of the Institute, but they're nicely balanced, and so you'll have a basic scientist like myself weighing in on the scientific merit of a particular proposal or project, and other members of council addressing the issue of unmet need, and sometimes the discussions are interesting. We cover a lot of topics, which is impressive to me. We cover everything from different types of science and grant applications to issues like training. And I think, again, the perspective that the members bring is quite diverse. Last round of council, we had a really effective discussion about training, I felt. What should be the amount of commitment that the Institute provides towards training the next generation of scientists? And I think that discussion went on for an hour or two, I believe. And I think in the end, we probably had an impact on changing some of the priorities for training purposes. So we cover a lot of ground. There's a lot of expertise, and I think there's a lot of impact that council brings to the funding priorities of the Institute.
Good, thank you. I'd like to turn now a little bit to what Alan referenced in terms of council members being asked to not just come with their own perspective of their own area of research or their own disease that they're focused on, but a broader perspective, and ask each of you to comment on that, because Kevin and David, I am obviously not a scientist myself, but even within the field of basic science, there's clearly specialties. Yes. And so how Paul's problem sometimes of looking at a grant application and wondering if it's actually in English is, I have to believe that even for research scientists, there are areas where you're looking at a grant application and this is not your field. And how are you able to review those applications and also be able to lift yourself up a little bit from your own world and give this the objective review that NINDS is asking for? Oh, it's not that hard a question.
Okay, perhaps I can address that. I think one of the privileges of being on council is that you get to see the bigger picture, meaning that there are so many things going on in the neuroscience field that an individual scientist or an individual review group may not get to see the wider scope of neuroscience. So I think that privilege that the council members have, I think that comes with some responsibility to ensure that there is programmatic balance in terms of the disorders that are represented and in terms of the different areas that are explored. Yes, I mean, all of us, many of you have your own scientific interests, you have your own disorders in which you would want to see research move forward. But I think with council members being on council, I think we have to put aside our own pet projects and our own specific personal interests and look at the much bigger picture, which means that there are a wide variety of areas in neuroscience and disorders that require support and funding. And so at least, I mean, for me, coming to council, working in the Tourette Syndrome Association, I have to somehow put that to the back of my mind when I'm on council and look at the greater good of neuroscience as a whole. So I think with that privilege of seeing the great picture of neuroscience, we are entrusted with putting aside our personal interest and look at neuroscience as a whole, and I think we do that quite well.
Yeah, so I think it's almost impossible to bring to the table your special interests. Program does a really good job at NINDS. I've been involved in 2 other institutes, and I have to say the program at NINDS is outstanding. And one of the things they do really well is bring to council the big picture and force us to think in terms of the big picture. And I think it's really difficult to actually bring special interest to most discussions.
I guess not reading the science so well, I would say there are 2 things that I'm aware of. One is just looking at the dollars, like having been involved in building of a clinical research network, I just have an efficiency focus, and poor Petra gets peppered by questions from me all the time about, well, have you thought about this and whatnot, and so it's not at all, it's really just for the benefit of the tax dollars and for disease research, focusing on that, I feel like is a leverage, not my particular condition focus. The other thing that I find myself doing is we do get into these incredibly rich debates that are largely over my head, but there will be differing opinions that have been beautifully expressed by very brilliant people on council. And then we take a vote, and I kind of view that part of my role is to think, kind of like a judge sitting on a circuit court trying to decide who made the most compelling argument and voting there to say, what do I believe in conflicting arguments? And I feel like that's part of the role as well, even though I don't necessarily have the domain expertise.
And I've been on council for 1 year, and I will tell you that Paul does participate. So there are no weeds sprouting out of his hair.
Amy, can I just?
Oh, please.
I just want to add one more thing. Yes, of course, there are times when we get grant applications and we have to go through the science to somehow make a sense of whether or not the funding is appropriate. Thankfully, in council, we have great expertise. We do have scientists and clinicians who are able to interpret some of the dense science that you mentioned. There are times, I think it's relatively rare, where the council as a whole, we get a sense of whether or not specific scientific experiments are relevant to the overall project itself. And thankfully, we have the power, I say, to strike some of the aims from some of the projects that come. So we do have the ability to modify some of the research that is proposed. And I don't think it's something that council likes to do, but there are times when we tend to get that deep into some of the.
Can we explore a little more, I think, and then David, I'll get to you. I think the 14% pay line is painful for all of us because a grant that scored in the 18th percentile, just picking that number out of a hat, is a darn good grant application. And so I'm wondering how you do play a second level review to study section, to peer review. What is your reaction as a council member if, for example, you saw something that's within the pay line and you are questioning how it got within the pay line? It's not bad, but you're kind of wondering why it got 12th percentile or something. And conversely, if something was 16th or 17th, and you think this looks like it's pretty compelling either scientifically or for programmatic reasons, do you raise that? Do you push that point at council?
Let me stop you guys.
We don't spend a lot of time on council second guessing the primary review. If a grant falls within the pay line, there's relatively little discussion, I would say, about the merit of that work. Occasionally, there'll be individual applications flagged, and there'll be greater discussion. But by and large, we don't generally touch much of the science that's within the pay line. Over the last year, I'd say the institute has chosen or specialed more grants outside the pay line, and those we do weigh on more carefully for scientific consideration and the consideration of the investigator and perhaps the unmet need of the work being addressed. So a small percentage of grants outside the pay line, there is more in-depth discussion.
And that's, just to keep the lingo straight, those are the high program priorities
High program priorities,
that Alan
right,
mentioned.
Right. Now, a lot of the grants that are funded by the Institute don't have a percentile score, and simply because there aren't enough of them in that particular category to rank order them in a percentile. These include program projects, clinical trials, and there's typically quite a bit of discussion about those grants. At clinical trials, we can spend an hour or more on a particular clinical trial. It's quite remarkable how much thought goes into these at the level of council.
Is there anything, I'd like to ask each of you, anything that has surprised you about being on council, or something that you learned about NINDS or your own work that you didn't expect to learn by being on council?
I didn't expect the process to work so well, and I really love the balance. I had coming on thought, well, there's a pay line, and that's and so we leave it up to the primary reviewers through CSR to determine what gets funded and what won't get funded. But what I really appreciate about being on council, about the way NINDS supports the work through the extramural program, is the balance of council: 6 basic scientists, 6 medical scientists, and 6 non-scientists bring great perspective. And so, for example, someone like myself spends a lot of time worrying about the scientific merit. Sharon might weigh in about an unmet need in a particular area, which I'm not thinking about. And Paul, as a businessman, will say, well, does this amount of money and the way the program is structured and supported by NINDS make sense, or could they more efficiently run this project with half the budget, given the view from a business perspective? And so those 3 types of perspectives meld nicely together at council, I'd say, to bring something that's much greater than any individual could bring to the review of an application.
I think the first thing, with all that goes on politically and whatnot, I think I had a fair amount of assumption about government bureaucracy, and this is an arm of government and a lot of presumption, which was pretty much so dispelled by being in council and the sort of the those of you that are staff, you can cover your ears. This is the sort of sucking up. You don't need to hear this part, but I was just very impressed with the people, their thought process, how strategic the thinking was, how well-rounded it was, and not only staff but Story's staff in particular. And so I came away just so refreshed after like the goat rodeo that I get to witness through news, and what I was, seeing here. I was like, wow, this is really reassuring. And sure, there are things that are bureaucratic. Recently to save money, they're not allowed to serve us food, and so Walter personally buys our coffee so that we can have a break, and we thank him profusely. And there are things that you just look at and you kind of go, oh. And every once in a while you see bureaucratic things that impact sort of the process and whatnot. But it was really incredibly refreshing overall. The other thing I would say is I think it's been very clear that it's not a rubber stamp, that I really feel listened to and see and engage, especially in some of these things that happen outside of council, like having program directors hear something and say, could you come and talk? Like the lunchtime discussions are just sort of fascinating and whatnot. But then some things that have sort of follow-up discussions, or some of these working groups, and really feeling like, oh, look, work gets done here, and then it might take a few councils before it works its way through to being something programmatic. But you really feel like you're having an impact because you're being listened to, and the views of the people around the table are really are respected. And it's really it's been very, very refreshing and not necessarily what I expected. I probably could come up with a bunch more things, but those are.
My thoughts are pretty much along the lines of Paul. For me, was refreshing to see and feel that the council is not simply a rubber stamp for what comes in. I mean, there are times when we think about these things as another layer of bureaucracy. But I think in this case, the council works extremely well and provides a second line of review. The other thing that struck me coming on council is the amount of almost personal investment that the program directors put into each project. To me, it's almost as if the various projects, the various grants are their own babies. In the way that they manage the projects and administer and do presentations. So I think, again, the council provides a vital role and plays a crucial component in the review process.
We do want to leave some time for questions. We have plenty more that I think I could ask, but I'd love it if people would ask questions. Shoot first.
Good morning. My name is Deneen Grooms. I'm from the American Academy of Neurology. This is my first meeting, and I find it very helpful. I do have a question. Could you explain a little bit more what a pay line is? That's new to me. Thanks.
Oh, God, I'm doing it myself. Fall into the government lingo, Alan, but I'll let you explain it. That's a very fair question.
For that set of applications where they are actually where the scores are compared. So just to, let me think of a simpler way to say it. For the standard kinds of grants we have, like the RO1s, which are kind of our bread and butter grants, those are reviewed by across all of NIH, about 400 different study sections. For NINDS, there are roughly 25 or 30 study sections at the Center for Scientific Review that review all applications in a particular scientific area. So things on basic neuroscience are not just grants from NINDS, they're also grants from NIMH and the Eye Institute and the Deafness Institute and so forth. And because there are so many different study sections, you need some way of comparing what they are. And so that's where they get a score, and then you say what fraction of applications had that score or better. So the example I gave was you got a score of 23. Well, what does that mean? Well, if only 2% of grants got 23 or better, that's like being at the top of the SATs. That's great. You're going to get into top-notch schools. If half the grants got 23 or better, then that's not so good. You're not going to get paid. And so in order to avoid tying up council, one of the reasons, discussing large numbers of outstanding grants, we don't want to discuss every grant that was reviewed. We set some level and say, okay, at this level of quality, we are comfortable paying everything in here. And then we're going to focus our discussion on the ones near that point. So it's among other things, a matter of efficiency and recognizing that. I think as Amy said, there's so much good science out there that really we recognize there's not a meaningful difference between some of these scores. And at some point, it wouldn't be useful to rehash the detailed discussions that the study sections had. And so we say, okay, we're going to pay everything that's better than this. And that has varied over the years from as generous as the 26th percentile back in the late 90s to the 9th percentile a few years ago, the darkest of our funding years. So they're currently at the 14th percentile. So those will just automatically be paid unless there is some egregious problem. I mean, if a council member noticed some major problem that the study section had missed, perhaps if there was something that was grossly unethical that couldn't be fixed, I mean, we don't have to pay them, and they can be looked at. And it's rare, but occasionally there are applications within Payline that for some reason would not be paid. But by and large, it's an efficiency, and just recognizing that it's not worth the time it would take to discuss things within a certain quality.
Did that make sense? Okay.
One thing so, Alan, can you just say, I think it's important to note that not all institutions are created equally, and it's a function of the decisions, the policy, the sort of strategy and decisions that control Payline. So like applications that could potentially be NICHD or NINDS, what are some of the other paylines?
Oh, NIA is a very different Payline, isn't it?
So they vary quite a bit, and a lot of it depends on what kinds of grants institutions support. So historically, the National Eye Institute has generally had the best payline. They do very few large projects. They don't do program projects. They don't support individual fellowships or predoctoral fellowships. They put a huge amount of their money into research grants. And so there's just a lot more money available for that. So at one point, their payline, when we were at the 26th percentile, they were at the 40th percentile. So it was a very great place to have your grant assigned there. There are other institutes where they have very large amounts of money tied up in big clinical networks, for example, or other kinds of networks. And that's the strategy they need to get done what they need to get done. And so they have less money available for the individual ones. And so the paylines, I think the scariest payline I heard, I think when we were at 9, I think there were institutes that were down as bad as maybe 4 or 5. I mean, there were some very, very bad years. It also really depends on the out years. So in a couple of cases, institutes had some projects where maybe the initial awards weren't that large, but it was like a balloon mortgage. There was some very big cost. I'm going to make this up, but let's just say in the initial years of, say, recruiting some number of patients for something, maybe it didn't cost that much, but then there was some very complicated, detailed follow-up study that you had to do, and if you're going to do it responsibly, you had to really put a lot of resources into it, but that meant there was a lot of money tied up at some point. So there are a variety of things like that. There are other things that can affect paylines, such as sometimes things get terminated. We decide they're not going so well, or yesterday we talked about, and Petra has been very effective at looking at some of our clinical trials, and if there's some issue, for example, with recruitment and it looks like it's not going to work, perhaps those trials will be stopped. And when that happens, sometimes there's a pool of money we're expecting to have to fund that is freed up. I would say the ballpark number we use, just to give you an estimate, is that each point on our pay line is on the order of $15 million. And so we look at, so at the beginning, one of the challenges is at the beginning of each fiscal year, we don't have a budget, and sometimes, we don't even know if we're going to be open for business, and we usually get a budget sometime around Christmas, although that has varied.
Or Easter.
But it's been April this year, right? We were uncertain until the March 26th continuing resolution, and then there was all this sequestration in the back. And there were a number of potential doomsdays out there during the past year. And so it can be very hard to set a pay line when you don't know what you've got. You don't want to make it too generous, because if you pay too many grants, then you're going to tie up everything, especially we got a 7% cut next year. We could end up with a 2% pay line if we're too generous this year with what we do. So it's the budgetary juggling act is challenging and scary.
There's a question up there.
You've spoken extensively about the activities that the council does. Can you speak to the time commitment that represents between the in-person meetings, teleconferences, working groups, the homework, and reviewing grants, et cetera?
I'm happy. It's 3 meetings a year. Each meeting is a day and a half. And a week to 10 days before the meeting, they send out the materials, which is usually some kind of white papers, background materials for initiatives that we'll be discussing at the open session, which is about the first 2/3 of the first day. And there's reading material for that. That's always in English. And then you go into the closed sessions, and that's individual grant applications. And they provide you, and I think this is an important transparency thing to know, there's as much there electronically as you could want to read in terms of the grant applications, and then the summary statements written by the staff and justification by the staff. And so you certainly need to prepare yourself for the meeting, but I think there's probably variation depending on what the grant application is, how deeply you go into each one. Is that fair?
Yeah.
The other thing I'd say is calls. I mean, I think like working groups are optional, and so, I had, I think, a meeting every 6 or 8 weeks for one of those that I had done. And, I fly from the West Coast, so I have an extra day. And I typically spend my first 3 or 4 hours reading the prepared materials, on the flight over, so that I'm prepared, and I try not to forget too much between then and the actual council meeting.
So first, for Dr. Willard, I'm dying to know, how does NINDS establish its strategic funding priorities? And then for the council members, is there a mandate for them to adhere to those priorities in their discussions?
That's an excellent question. There are a variety of ways that we go about setting both an overall plan and then sometimes individual strategies, either for particular areas such as training or development of the workforce or things like that, or strategic plans for particular areas of research. So there are a number of different inputs that go into it. We do not start each year having said we're going to spend X amount on this, 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 and this. I think as we talked about yesterday, there are hundreds of different disorders that we're responsible for. And one of the other benefits of having the pay line is that it is area neutral. It's just picking the best research that we have. And so one of the strategies that we use is to say, we're going to set aside a substantial amount of money just for whatever comes out best. And then we're going to use the input of council to look at other things. And there are analyses that our staff do in each area. I mean, each of our program staff are responsible for particular areas, and they're monitoring what's going on, both in terms of what are the opportunities, how many applications are we getting. And so part of the strategic planning has to do with looking at things like, okay, there's a real scientific opportunity here, and we're not seeing anything coming here. Maybe there's something happening a lot in the cancer field that would be really good in neuroscience or neurology, and we're not seeing it. And our staff often will work with people to try to encourage them. But one of the other ways that you can try to encourage people is to set aside a pot of money saying, we would really like to receive applications in this area. And so one of the other functions of council is to present the results of this analysis and say, look, we think this is an area where we could be doing more at this time, and we'd like to grease the wheels, as it were, by making some money available to entice people to come into the field. So there are a number of different ways that we go about trying to stimulate research in different areas. There are some, one of the other things I guess I should say is we have an Office of Science Policy and Planning, and among other things, they analyze very carefully the language that we see during appropriations hearings or anything that comes up if and when an actual appropriations bill is passed. And sometimes there are comments by people in Congress, it would be nice if X happens, and that's sort of a hint we should be paying attention to that and seeing, are there opportunities there? And so that we'd be crazy to be deaf to that. I don't know, Story, did you want to comment on that? Yeah.
So a number of years ago, when we were at the 9th percentile, we recognized that we desperately needed to look at how we were funding our research and how we were spending our money, and went through a pretty detailed planning process. Those summaries are actually on our website, and perhaps for this audience, one of the most interesting pieces of that planning process was focused on disease and how do we manage to create a landscape, an understanding of the landscape for all of our diseases or classes of diseases, and understand where there's significant need that could be where we could encourage applications or where there are particular opportunities. So that's an effort that we are still working on how best to do. And in terms of once we have initiatives and particular areas of focus, does council's advice adhere strictly to that? Actually, if there are no meritorious grants, no highly meritorious grants, we won't follow through on funding. And I can think of one example where we were trying to encourage translational research in a particular disorder, had set aside money, and there were no applications that were worth funding. So I think it would have been completely inappropriate for council to have said, but you said you were going to do this, so fund something, or for us to fund it if, in fact, the investment wouldn't lead to anything that would be of high value. And a piece of that planning process that I want to emphasize, which I mentioned yesterday, is as a consequence of that planning process, we went through all the long-term projects that we had, and we assessed them and closed a number of them down. One of them was a clinical research consortium meant to engage private physicians in our clinical trials, and it was a contract. It was $15 million over 5 years. It was a dismal failure for a variety of reasons. Practicing clinicians are incredibly busy. We weren't offering them enough money to participate, and the trials were too complicated. And you heard Petra talk about some of our protocols are too complicated. And in the past, we probably would have let the experiment go on for 10 years, but we said, this is not going to work, won't achieve the goal. And Petra's put in place a number of other ways to meet the need to recruit patients. So,
Thank you, Story. The second half of your question was, do council members feel bound by those initiatives? And I'll flip that around. Do we feel comfortable questioning the initiative sometimes, even if meritorious applications do come in? And we are completely out of time, so I'll just say if you disagree with what I'm going to quickly say, then you should chime in otherwise. I have been coming to the open portion for years, and now I'm on council. I think council members feel completely free to say, can someone explain to me why we're doing this? Because and I think that's and in the open portion too. And I think some of you may, if you come tomorrow, you'll see that. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Yeah. They are lively sometimes. So we are completely out of time. I know there's more questions, but we're already after 9 o'clock. So sorry, and thank you for listening.